Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weep Union, and in this one there are numerous advances across the front line. The Russians have managed to advance in the southwestern parts of the Zaporizhzhia region, the eastern outskirts of it. The Russians also managed to advance to the east of Myrnohrad and Pokrovsk, as well as within Kupiansk in the northeastern parts of the front line, where the Ukrainians managed to regain control over some positions here along the border between Russia and Ukraine internationally after months of fighting. Starting out in the northern section of the front line, the Ukrainians managed to regain control over Novokoshentinivka. This is after 2 months of fighting over the settlement. The Russians refused to withdraw, similarly to the fighting within the Kindrativka, while the Ukrainians managed to recapture Kindrativka. The town of Novokoshentinivka was fought over between the Russian and Ukrainian forces. The Ukrainians kept attempting to land within the settlement. After succeeding to land after a week of fighting, the Ukrainians slowly pushed deeper and deeper within the settlement, where they kept resupplying and sending new troops, while the Russians did the same, having forces within the settlement. Now, after about 2 months of fighting, the Ukrainians now have gained control of it, and fighting has now switched to Koshentinivka and the vicinity of the settlement, where the Ukrainians are fighting from the Kindrativka direction, from Novokoshentinivka and through the river line to the southeast. The Russian defense of Novokoshentinivka managed to hold until the fall of Kindrativka, the Ukrainians flanking the supply lines of the Russians by attacking from Kindrativka towards Novokoshentinivka and Koshentinivka itself. The Russians were more hard-pressed to resupply their forces, and now, some weeks after the Ukrainian capture of Kindrativka, the Russians have now lost control over the settlement, and fighting is taking place along the border section. The Russians do not have any significant supply lines leading into Koshentinivka. This means that they are limited in their ability to resupply their forces, and it is fairly isolated from the remaining parts of the Russian Sumy incursion. We're seeing that the Russians have captured Yunikivka, but since then they have not advanced beyond it. Instead, the Ukrainians have been launching continuous counterattacks. It is very clear that the Russians are pulling a similar maneuver to the Kharkiv incursion, where they are switching completely to defense, keeping Ukrainian forces occupied in the northern section of the front line, while they continue their own offensive operations on the remaining parts from Zaporizhzhia in the south to Kharkiv in the east, where the Russians now continue their offensive operations within Kupiansk. We see with this shield-gated footage, the Russians are slowly advancing through the apartment complex area, gaining control over the 2 school areas here in the northern outskirts of the apartment complexes. The Russians are fighting over the apartment complex area here in the northwestern parts and here in the eastern parts of the city. Russians are slowly moving through these apartment complex buildings to gain full control over the northern railway area of Kupiansk, which includes the industrial area, the apartment complex areas, both of which will allow the Russians to have a solid control over the western parts of Kupiansk in the northern section, and to have the upper hand in the city itself, as well as to develop offensive operations across the river line into the eastern parts of Kupiansk, where the Russian soldiers are already present. So we're seeing continuous positional fighting within the Kupiansk direction, where the Russians are fighting over Moskovka, with the Ukrainian counterattack constantly attacking them from the northwestern and southwestern flanks to keep the Ukrainians out of the city itself, while the Russians at the same time push through the city to gain control of it. Moving further south towards the Donetsk region, the Russians have managed to advance in the eastern flank of Myrnohrad and Pokrovsk. The Russians have managed to not just secure Novoekonomishne, but also develop offensive operations beyond it, as well as Myrnohrad. The Ukrainians have been claiming that they were counterattacking to the south of Razine, which can be true, as the industrial area itself is in the gray zone, as well as the fortified positions here to the west of Novoekonomishne. However, with geolocated footage coming out of the Russian forces to the southeast of Myrnohrad in the forest patch area, and now in the forest lines to the south, it is clear that the Russians have control over Novoekonomishne, and that they are developing the offensive operations here to the east of Myrnohrad in the vicinity of Balahan and Kosatske. Both of these settlements are just outside of Myrnohrad, and the Russians are here working on gaining control over the fortified positions of the Ukrainians here near Hrodivka to strengthen the supply routes and the connection of the forces from Hrodivka in the south to Novoekonomishne in the north, further strengthening the resupply of the forces here to the east of Myrnohrad, where the current supply line is going through from Avdiivka through Ochiritsine up towards Novoalexandrivka, Ostyshenka, through to the intersection, through Melenivka, and then onwards to Novoekonomishne, or along the river line itself through to Myrolyubivka. If the Russians are able to gain control over these forest lines here to the south of Novoekonomishne and Myrolyubivka, the fortified positions in the area, then the Russians can resupply through the city of Donetsk onwards towards Novohrodivka and Hrodivka, where the supplies can go through from Hrodivka up north. The Russians are using local settlements as supply hubs for their frontline positions. The larger the areas, the more basements, the more apartment complex buildings, the more supplies they can store in one area. The Russian forces operating west of Pokrovsk are mainly supplied through Selidove, here to the southeast of Pokrovsk through Novohrodivka, and then there is Hrodivka here to the east of Myrnohrad. Connecting Hrodivka with the forces in Novoekonomishne by gaining control of the area just north of the settlement will allow the Russians to establish a supply hub within Hrodivka and develop offensive operations from the settlement in the direction of Myrnohrad, combined with the forces in Novohrodivka. The Russians can strengthen their offensive operations coming from the south of these cities. This further secures the Russian positions here to the northeast of Pokrovsk. If they're able to capture the industrial area and the outskirts of Myrnohrad as well, they'll have completely secured the southern flank to resupply the forces north of Pokrovsk. They can strengthen their offensive operations towards Rodinske and their counterattack operations in the direction of Volodymyrivka, Shakhove, and further north in the direction of Sofiivka and Toretsk. This means that the Ukrainian counterattack to the north would have failed if the Russians have secured their positions, and will further develop offensive operations to secure the supply lines from Hrodivka up towards Rodinske. Because if the Russians are able to resupply their forces from Hrodivka to Novoekonomishne, then the supplies coming from the east will be redirected to Rodinske and the Russian positions west of the river line. That means they'll have different supply lines for the different areas rather than having the entire area resupplied through one single supply line. This also will limit the effectiveness of Ukrainian strikes on Russian supply lines. To the southwest of Pokrovsk in the eastern outskirts of the Zaporizhzhia region, the Russians continue their offensive operations along the first line of defense here in the Zaporizhzhia region, gain control over additional fortified positions and reaching the outskirts of Novoivanivka, which is the next settlement along the road connecting through the rear of the first line of defense to Vulyaipole. The Russians also managed to gain control over the settlement of Olhivske. The Russians continue their offensive operations along the first and second lines of defense, gaining full control over the Vovchi River line all the way towards Orestopil and Velomyrailivka, and they are also developing offensive operations along the first and second lines of defense here in the Zaporizhzhia and Dnipropetrovsk regions. It is clear that the Russians are developing offensive operations towards Vulyaipole through the fortified lines, bypassing them from their weak points and gaining control over the settlements to the south of them as they get closer and closer to these fortifications. With the Russian capture of the positions to the east of these fortifications and the development of offensive operations through them, they are making the Ukrainian fortifications to nothing else but buying time for the Ukrainian forces. They will not be increasing the casualties the Russians are taking, but instead simply be buying time for them to build new fortifications. As we're seeing in the Zaporizhzhia direction, they're now building fortifications on the entire riverbank around the city to prevent any Russian breakthrough through the flanks, whereas as we are seeing here in the Zaporizhzhia direction, breaching one part of the defensive line has allowed them to completely bypass the defensive lines, even though it was multi-layered. The Russian capture of Olhivske is possible due to the Russians flanking the town from the north, making control over the forest lines and forest patches here to the north of the settlement and developed offensive operations along the first line of defense. isolating the settlement from the supply lines of their forces, left the Ukrainian garrison weakened, and with control over the northern bank of the Solona River, they were able to push through the settlement with northern flank under their control, pushing the Ukrainians back out of the settlement through their supply line down towards Poltavka. Now the Russians will likely move on to Poltavka, as they've managed to gain control over Myrnohrad to the south of the settlement and everything to the east of it. With this, the Russians will continue developing their offensive operations to the southeast and northeast of Huliaipole, as they continue their offensive operations along the first line of defense to gain control over the logistical hub, which will allow their forces to continue offensive operations in the direction of Orihov to the west and along the highway to the north to develop offensive operations not just in the Zaporizhzhia region, but also into the Dnipropetrovsk region, gain control over additional supply hubs and logistical hubs for their forces to gather more forces and stronger offensive capabilities for offensive operations deeper and deeper into the Zaporizhzhia region behind the fortified lines along the southern flank. The Russians also continue their offensive operations on the western outskirts of the Zaporizhzhia region, where they've managed to gain a foothold within Myrnohrad, the northern part of the settlement. The Russians are here continuing their offensive operations within the Myrnohrad direction to gain control over the settlement and the surrounding fortified positions. The Russians are developing offensive operations within the Dacha area to the west and within the settlement itself, which will allow the Russians to infiltrate the defensive line and break through the initial parts of it, attacking Orihov from the western flank through the fortified positions weak spot and the eastern flank through Huliaipole. The Russians are slowly dismantling the Ukrainian defensive lines here in the south. With regards to developments beyond the front line, the new year is closing in with only 3 months to 2026. And for this, Ukraine is already preparing their new sales speech for the next year. The Ukrainians are claiming that they'll be needing $120 billion for the next year, citing the increase in Russian defense spending. $120 billion is not unrealistic if the United States was paying half of that, but they are not anymore. According to the Kiel Institute, the United States have given approximately $500 million since January of 2025 through June of 2025. The first half of the year has seen $500 million in aid to Ukraine, military aid to Ukraine. As for the next couple of months, I believe that there has been announced another $500 million of aid. It's about $1 billion of aid for 2025, where Europe has sent approximately 40 billion, which is a third of what Ukraine is requesting, and that is for 2025, the first half of the year. This means if the European aid continues at the current rate, they'll be giving about 66% or 2/3 of what Ukraine is asking for yearly. The question is, at this point, can European countries continue at their current rate? And if they can they then increase it with up to 40% so that they can reach the level necessary for Ukraine to continue fighting at the level they are fighting at? That is not to mention, even if they get all the funding that they need, do the Ukrainians have enough manpower to continue fighting? So there are all these questions that need to be answered, and that is besides the point if Russia is able to continue outpacing the Ukrainians even at this point, where the Ukrainians have not been able so far to launch a successful counterattack against the Russians throughout 2025, where their last successful offensive was the Kursk incursion, which was negated within half a year, and somewhat reversed within 8 months. A lot of questions, but no answers, only time will tell. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.